Hello and good morning, and welcome to the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, International Standards on Quality Management 1, Quality Management for Firms, all you need to know about the firm's risk assessment process. Next slide. Today's event will be approximately 1 hour in length. We alert you to the fact that today all attendees' microphones are automatically muted. Your videos will be turned off. And if you cannot stay on the event for the entire time, this presentation will be recorded and is being live streamed to the IAASB YouTube channel. For this event, please use the icon at the bottom of the black toolbar on your screen labeled Q&A to input any questions that you may have for today's presenters, panelists, and moderators. Please note that in addition to being available on the YouTube channel, the recording will also be available on the IFAC events and webinars page. At the conclusion of today's event, you will be asked to take a brief survey to give us insight into the satisfaction of your participation and any comments or suggestions you may have for improvements going forward. At this time, we will begin, and I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, Chiew. Next slide, please. And over to you, Chun.
Thank you very much, Gabby. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, depending on where you call home. I want to add on to Gabby's welcome. Thank you so much for joining us at today's webinar on the firm's risk assessment process. As Gabby introduced, my name is Chun. I'm a member of the IWASB. In my day job, I work for the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants as ACCA's Regional Head of Policy for ASEAN and Australia, New Zealand. I'm delighted to be your moderator for today's webinar. The world is continuously changing and evolving, so is our profession. The quality management standard has been introduced in response to those changes and to promote a new approach to managing quality that is proactive, that is agile, and responsive to future changes. In this journey to improving quality, the IAASB has addressed important issues such as governance and leadership, and the crucial need for an approach that is scalable for firms ranging from the smallest, least complex at one end of the spectrum to the largest firms with multiple business units, geographic presence, functions, and service lines. Approved in December last year, the suite of quality management standards brought about much needed and fundamental changes the way firms and audit teams manage quality. Now, ISQM 1 is the standard that addresses the firm's system of quality management, and it has seen the most substantial change from the standard in place today. In particular, ISQM 1 drives firms towards a much more proactive and much more robust approach to managing quality through introducing a brand new process that is anchored on risk and that is designed to deal with risk. We call it the firm's risk assessment process. Now, while there are many components to ISQM 1, in today's webinar, we will be focusing on the firm's risk assessment process because it forms the backbone to the system. And as you're aware, we have 3 other webinars coming up, taking place over the next 2 months, July and August. And we will be covering other key aspects of ISQM 1 in those webinars. Now I want to introduce you to our key speakers today, Julie Cordon and Natalie Klonaridis. Together, they will take us through the firm's risk assessment process. So Julie and Natalie, welcome, and can I hand it over to you now to say hello and tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Sure, thanks Chung-Mi. I'll give it a start. So my name is Julie Cordon. I am also a IWASB board member like Chun-Mi, and I am the chair and had the honor of being the chair of the ISQM 1 task force. So I spent quite a bit of time working through the ISQM1 standard and was very happy when the board approved it last fall. When I'm not spending time on my IWASB work, I am a partner at Deloitte Canada, and I work in our national office. So I have responsibility for audit standards, audit methodology, and how that methodology is implemented across the firm. And most recently, I've taken on the role as the ISQM1 leader for the Canadian firm of Deloitte. So intimately involved in the implementation efforts of ISQM1, and I'm happy to be here with you today. So maybe Natalie, over to you for an introduction.
Great, thank you, Julie and Chun-Wee. So my name is Natalie Klonaridis. I'm a Deputy Director at the IAASB. I joined the IAASB back in 2016, and since that time have been working on ISQM1. So I've been working on this project for a number of years, and like Julie, I was very excited to get the standard issued and published in December last year. It's really great to see so many participants joining us today. So really thank you to all for spending the morning with us and learning more about the firm's risk assessment process. So back over to you, Chun-Wee.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Natalie. We are very keen to hear from you as well, our participants who have joined us live today. We want to hear about your experience, your concerns. We want you to share your questions with us. So please share your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom panel. And following Julie's and Natalie's presentation, we will try to answer as many of your questions as possible. But let me just say upfront, don't worry if we don't manage to get to your questions today. We will endeavor to address them in the upcoming webinar. So do keep your questions coming. So with that, Julie and Natalie, the floor is all yours.
Thank you again, Chun-Wee. If I could have the next slide, please. So Chun-Wee did an excellent job of describing ISQM1, so I don't think I'll spend too much time on that one here, but just to give you some background and really to set the scene for where we are from a quality management perspective. ISQM1 was one of 3 standards that were approved in the fall, last fall, by the IWASB. And ISQM1 really, as Chun-Wee mentioned, sets the foundation at the firm level for the establishment of a quality management system. And it affects all of the engagements that a firm does under the IWASB standards. ISQM2 is brand new, so you wouldn't have had an ISQM2 before, but ISQM2 is the standard that deals with engagement quality reviews. So despite the fact that it is brand new with no previous standard, some of the content that was in ISQC1, so the predecessor of ISQM1, and ISA 220, which is the quality management at the engagement level, did make its way into ISQM2. So some of it would be familiar to you, but there are some brand new concepts within ISQM2. And then lastly, ISA 220 revised is the quality management standard at the audit engagement level. So it applies to audits of financial statements, and it's really how the engagement partner is expected to exhibit and drive quality at the engagement level itself. ISA 220 revised replaces ISA 220 that was in existence previously in the suite of ISAs. And as I mentioned, all of these standards are interconnected. ISQM1 provides the basis at the firm level, ISQM2 is at the engagement quality review level, and ISA 220 is at the engagement level. Next slide, please. I also wanted to highlight some of the key changes to ISQM1 because ISQM1 brought about a number of key changes to quality management. So I'm going to highlight some of those here on the slide. First and foremost, there was a shift. So we shifted from a quality control mindset to a quality management mindset. And you'll actually notice that the name of the standard changed. So ISQC1, the predecessor to ISQM1, was a quality control standard. ISQM1 being a quality management standard. And this is really achieved through the incorporation of a risk-based approach. So how does the firm manage risks to quality? The standard's been designed to be able to be used by all sizes of firms. So Chun-Wee mentioned the larger firms to the very, very small firms. We kept that in mind as a task force. How do we make the standard scalable? And really the risk-based approach is how we do that because it facilitates a tailoring and an ability for a firm to scale their system because the risks are focused on what could go wrong, which takes into account the nature and circumstances of the firm and the engagements it performs. So it really is tailored to how a firm exists and the engagements in which it performs. The new standard is really meant to drive an iterative, proactive, and integrated approach to managing quality. So it's looking at the system as a whole, as opposed to focusing on individual elements from maybe a more compliance mindset in the past. The ISQM1 process itself is really three main pieces: establishing the quality objectives, which are set out in the standard. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So those quality objectives represent what does the firm need to do to achieve and manage quality of its engagements. And then in order to achieve those objectives, the firm needs to think about what could go wrong. So what could adversely affect the achievement of those objectives? And that is when we start talking about identifying and assessing quality risks. So really part of that firm's risk assessment process. And then lastly, and a big piece of it is also designing and implementing responses. So once you have your risks, what are the responses that the firm needs to put in place to address the risks? Governance and leadership is key. Chun, we mentioned that on the outset. Governance and leadership was a really important piece that we implemented in ISQM1. And the standard more robustly addresses the roles and responsibility of leadership and holds them accountable for their roles. We did need to think about modernization. So within ISQM1, there are areas where the standard's been modernized. So for instance, how does the firm address technology? How does the firm operate within a network if that's applicable? And how does the firm use external service providers? Because we know, big or small, all firms use some sort of service providers. And then there's a flow of information that happens in the system. It happens in the firm. So how does the flow of information happen, and how does that link up with the quality risks and being able the firm to respond? Monitoring remediation, very important, not new, but an important component of a system's quality of management. So there are opportunities within ISQM1 for a firm to be more proactive and potentially modernize some of their monitoring and remediation efforts. On to the next slide, please. So I mentioned ISQM1 replaces ISQC1, and it's responsible, a firm is responsible for implementing ISQM1 if it performs any of the following engagements. So you have the scope there on the slide. So audits and reviews of financial statements, other assurance engagements. So extended external reporting is a hot topic these days. That would be covered under ISQM1, or potentially reports on controls at service organizations. And then you have your related services engagement, so compilations and agreed upon procedures. What I'm seeing already, and I'm sure others can agree, ISQM1 will impact various aspects of the firm. It might be well beyond those that are just performing those engagements that I just mentioned. So firm strategy, firm culture, business process and operations all have a role to play in ISQM1 and the operation of a system of quality management. Human resources is large, so there's quite a tie to resources in ISQM1, whether those are human resources, technological resources, or the intellectual resources a firm use. Also the integration with an IT function. So I know that big or small, firms all rely on their IT function, and that will play a role in the implementation of the system of quality management. Resourcing and allocation and staffing will be important. And there are other aspects that I won't go into at length, but things within the firm structure that deal with relevant ethical requirements, your independence function, and those areas will also be touched by ISQM1 implementation. Next slide, please. So with that, Natalie, I'm turning it over to you.
Great, thank you, Julie. So if you think of a machine, it has various components to it. It has a motor, it has a power source, it has a frame, it has a regulation system. And of course, all of these pieces of the machine are very important to being able to enable the machine to operate and operate properly. And if there is a piece missing from that machine, either it doesn't work or it doesn't work very effectively. And I like to think of ISQM1 in a similar way. ISQM1 consists of a number of components, and each of these components is necessary in order for the system as a whole to really work properly and effectively. So as you see on the slide, we have a diagram here that shows all of the 8 components that are embedded in ISQM1, and each of these components serves a bit of a different purpose. We have 2 components that are processes in nature. So one is the process that the firm puts in place to identify risks and design responses, which Judy explained just now. We have another process in ISQM1, and that's the monitoring and remediation process. So looking at, taking through monitoring activities that they are implemented to identify any deficiencies and then remediate those deficiencies. We then have the governance and leadership component. And this is very similar to the control environment that you would see in other types of control frameworks. We then have components that deal with things that the firm needs to have to be able to operate the system and perform engagements. So those are your resources and your information and communication. And then we have 3 more components that deal with specific topics that are fundamental for engagement performance. And those are the 3 components that sit on the inner circle in the diagram. Now, what's very important is, like the machine, these components are really intended to operate together. They don't operate individually. They're very integrated and interconnected. So for example, if you look at the processes, for example, the monitoring and remediation process, that is something that you apply to the entire system. You're monitoring the entire system. And similarly, when you're looking at the firm's risk assessment process, you're identifying risks and designing responses for all of the other components that sit within your system. Another example is resources. You need people across the system to do monitoring, to deal with ethical requirements, to deal with acceptance and continuance. So resources is also something that really spans across all of the other components as well. So of course, for the remainder of this webinar, we really will be focused now on the firm's risk assessment process. But as Chun mentioned in the introductory remarks, we will take a closer look at some of these other components in some of our other upcoming webinars. If we can go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So as Julie mentioned, the new risk-based approach is something that was newly introduced into ISQM1, and this has been a really important area of change from the existing standard. And really the key goal of the risk-based approach is to drive firms to think about what it is that their system needs to look like based on the firm's circumstances. So looking at the size and the complexity of the firm, the types of engagements the firm performs, what does that system really need to look like? The risk-based approach recognizes that, of course, firms can't get to everything. So it's about focusing on those risks that really meet the threshold. And Julie will cover that in a bit in terms of how you go about identifying and assessing the quality risks. But it's really, as Julie mentioned, about focusing on what can go wrong and then putting mechanisms in place to prevent those things from going wrong. So as you see on the slide, the firm's risk assessment process comprises of a number of steps, and I think Julie outlined these as establishing the quality objectives, identifying and assessing the quality risks, and designing and implementing the responses. The process also comprises a final piece where the firm needs to have policies or procedures in place to pick up any information that may indicate that something needs to be adjusted in the system. So it's not really a case of just designing the system and then carrying on in autopilot mode. It's really important that the system is updated as and when it needs to be and being responsive to changes in the firm's circumstances or responding to changes as a result of deficiencies identified through monitoring. Now, the firm's risk assessment process, so the actual process itself also needs to be designed by the firm. And the design of that process is probably something that firms might want to start thinking about first when initiating their implementation efforts, because of course that is the process that the firm will then use to identify quality risks and design responses for all of the other components. So things that a firm might want to think about as you're setting up your firm's risk assessment process is, of course, who's going to be responsible for the process. But you might want to also think about things about how your firm is organized. So do you have different business units or geographical locations? With that may drive then who actually needs to be involved in the firm, in the design of the firm's risk assessment process, and it then in identifying risks and designing responses. So you may need to have a broad range of people involved in that process. It might need to involve perhaps IT people or human resource people, because as Julie mentioned, this does go beyond just your typical kind of engagement teams. It does extend further into the firm. There may be different ways to actually approach identifying the risks and designing the responses. So in some instances, some firms may go with an approach of where there's some sort of generic risks or generic responses that are then handed down to your business units or geographical regions, and then they go away and work on those, build those out, and then everybody comes back together to really collaborate on those. So that would kind of be more of a top-down approach, versus a different way that may be approach it is each business unit or geographical region coming up with their own risks and responses for their regions, and then coming together and collaborating on those. So more of a bottom-up approach. So there is a number of different ways to approach the risk identification and designing those responses. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So let's take a walk through the actual firm's risk assessment process. So I'm first going to focus on the part where we establish quality objectives. And before we really get into that, I'd like to just take a bit of a step back to the overall objective of ISQM 1. So the objective of the firm in ISQM 1 is to design, implement, and operate a system of quality management. And like any system, it's very important that we're also clear what it is that the system needs to achieve. And really the overarching goal of the system is to have a system that provides reasonable assurance that the engagements are being performed properly and that the reports that are issued are also appropriate. Now, if you think of that objective, it is actually very high level. And there are, of course, many things that a firm will actually need to do to accomplish that overall objective. And so what we've done is we've come up with the outcomes that the firm needs to achieve in order that the overall objective is achieved. And these we refer to as the quality objectives in ISQM 1. So each component in ISQM 1, except for the monitoring and remediation component and the firm's risk assessment process, has a set of quality objectives that need to be achieved for that component. Now, the quality objectives in the components are, in our view, very comprehensive, but there is, of course, a possibility that the firm may need to have additional quality objectives over and above those in order to achieve that overall objective of the system. So this is actually a requirement in ISQM 1 that the firm needs to consider whether they need to have any additional quality objectives, which would be considered in the context of the firm's environment. So these quality objectives that we have set out in the components really help the firm in properly identifying and assessing the quality risks, because of course it focuses the firm more on what exactly needs to be achieved and then what can go wrong in achieving those quality objectives. So you may ask, particularly if you're from a smaller firm, is my firm expected to establish all of these quality objectives and in the components in ISQM 1? And the short answer is yes, unless of course a quality objective is not relevant to your firm. So there may be a situation where, for example, it's a sole practitioner who has no staff. In ISQM 1, there are a number of quality objectives that deal with human resource elements or direction, supervision, and review of the engagement team. And in that instance, some of those quality objectives may not be relevant. The other thing I wanted to mention is that some firms may actually decide to establish what we call sub-objectives. And this is completely optional for the firm. So this is taking the objectives in the components and breaking them down a little bit further, which may be useful to the firm in order to be able to identify quality risks and then further to that to design responses. This also may be a useful mechanism where there are multiple process owners or business units and you really want to assign objectives to particular people to really drive that responsibility and accountability. So with that, Julie, I'll hand back over to you to take us through the risk identification and assessment.
Thanks, Natalie. If I could have the next slide, please. This slide it helps set out the process the firm is meant to go through in order to identify and assess quality risks. And I don't know about you, but I always prefer a visual to help me understand a process. So it's almost like on an engagement where you have a process flow diagram to show you the different steps. And yes, there are different steps on this slide, but it doesn't mean that each step has to be individually done. It just means in combination, when you're performing your risk assessment process and thinking about quality risks, you're thinking about all of these different pieces. So the process really focuses first on understanding the various conditions, events, circumstances, actions, and inactions related to the firm and its engagements. And really what you're trying to do there is understand what those are, what those items are, and how they might affect the achievement of the quality objectives that Natalie just walked us through. Because the quality objectives are really the set foundation and establishment of what we think a firm needs to have in order to get reasonable assurance over their system of quality management. So just to emphasize, the firm is required to understand these because those conditions or events affect or could adversely affect the achievement of those quality objectives. Once you've thought about that, so you have that full understanding of all of those items, you move on to thinking about what of those items would rise to the level of a quality risk. And so when you're thinking about quality risk, you take into account two things. So those auditors out there will think of this as familiar to how we understand risks in an audit engagement, but you're really thinking about two things: how and the degree to which those conditions and events, circumstances, actions, or inactions might affect the achievement of the quality objectives. And then you also have to factor in the possibility of occurrence. So if you think about this, if you didn't have the possibility of occurrence in there, you could have such a large population of things that might adversely affect your quality objectives. It would be really hard to develop a system of quality management and really narrow it down to the things that would possibly happen or likely happen in order to affect your quality objectives. So it is the two pieces that work together, and working together with those two pieces has you meet a threshold for a quality risk. And that's really important piece in identifying what rises to the level of a quality risk. And then lastly, the assessment of the quality risk is also affected by how those conditions, events, circumstances, actions, or inactions affect the quality objective and the possible occurrence. So as a result, what we see probably most often is that the identification and assessment of the quality risk is undertaken in one process simultaneously. It's not really oftentimes a discrete, separate process. A firm might choose to do it in two discrete steps, but I think what we're seeing more often than not is that's happening sort of as an iterative process all at once, as you think through what is affecting your quality objectives and then what therefore will rise to the level of a quality risk. Keep in mind, important note, that a quality risk is not a risk to quality. A quality risk is a risk to achieving the quality objectives that Natalie just walked us through in ISQM 1. So that's an important distinction to make. On to the next slide. So we thought as a task force and as a board that it was important to promote a consistent application of this risk identification and assessment process. It is really foundational to ISQM 1. And so in order to drive that consistency, ISQM 1 has conditions, events, circumstances, actions, or inactions that the firm is required to understand. So they are listed out in the standard, and they are focused on the firm and how it would impact their engagements. Paragraph 25(a) of the standard sets those out, and it expects the firm to understand them and take them into account and therefore identify quality risks as a result. It's essential to note, though, that that list is not exhaustive. That is a list that we thought was, in most cases, common and would drive a consistent firm's risk assessment process. But there could be other conditions or events that a firm needs to consider in identifying quality risks and thinking about how a control objective might be, a quality objective might be impacted. And then furthermore, there could be circumstances that not all of those conditions or events in the standard are applicable to every quality objective. So a firm will need to think about that as they perform their risk assessment process. Moving on, thank you. So responses, the last piece of the puzzle in the firm's risk assessment process. Responses need to be properly designed and implemented to address those quality risks that you identified in the previous slide. And those responses need to mitigate the possibility that that quality risk would occur. And therefore, that will help the firm in achieving the overall quality objectives. In order to address the quality risk, the firms needs to think about the reasons for the assessments, and the responses also need to think about that. So when you were thinking about identifying your quality risk and you thought about how that risk might arise, that should help drive your design of your responses. So think back to how and the degree to which those conditions, events, circumstances would affect the achievement of the quality objectives. And as I mentioned, possibility of occurrence being important. Think about that when you're thinking of your responses and how those responses need to consider that, that aspect as well. ISQM 1 does not contain a list of required responses. There are some specified responses in one of the paragraphs, paragraph 34 of ISQM 1, that the firm must design and implement, but it is not similar to the quality objectives in that we have a list of responses in ISQM 1 for the firm to implement. The responses need to come from the development of the firm's risk assessment process and what responses the firm needs to put in place to address the quality risks. Those specified responses in the standard are not comprehensive and would not address all quality risks. And so there is the need to address and identify additional responses. Next slide, please. And Natalie, I hand it back to you.
Great, thanks, Julie. So, of course, a really key part of ISQM 1 is proactively managing the quality. So it's very important that the firm actually identifies information, events, or things that are happening within the firm or within the firm's environment that the firm actually needs to go and respond to. So we therefore have a requirement in ISQM 1 for the firm to establish policies or procedures that will identify that information that indicates that the firm may need to go and revisit the quality objectives, quality risks, or responses. So this information could really be a couple of things. So it could be changes in the firm, changes in the firm's environment, or perhaps it could be changes in the engagements that the firm performs. So perhaps the firm has entered into a new industry. And I think COVID is actually a really good example here of where something happened in the firm's environment that would have some sort of impact on the system of quality management. The other source of information may be coming from the firm's monitoring and remediation activities. So the firm may have identified a deficiency, and through understanding the root cause of that deficiency, may have worked out that, in fact, actually something needs to be revisited in the quality objectives, quality risks, or responses. So you may ask what changes can be made or need to be made to the quality objectives, quality risks, or responses. And it could be a number of things. So it could be that perhaps you're going to add a quality risk or a response, or even a quality objective, or you may want to amend those. So maybe it's tweaking a response or a quality risk. It could also be removing things. So perhaps the firm has a response in place and the firm identifies that there's perhaps a more effective or more efficient response. So they may replace the response with another response. It could also be amending the responses or the quality risks. What's very important here, though, is when it comes to the quality objectives, that the firm needs to exercise caution, of course, in amending those quality objectives. The quality objectives in ISQM 1, as we covered previously, it is expected that firms have those quality objectives in place. So unless it's something that's relating to an additional quality objective that the firm has established, the firm needs to exercise caution in changing any of those quality objectives that are the ones that exist in the standard. So the policies and procedures that the firm puts in place to identify the information that may need to indicate that changes are needed to the system may look very different between a more complex firm and a less complex firm. So if we think about a less complex firm, so a very small firm, a lot of the things that are going on in the firm may be very centralized, and it may all sit with a central person that has access to all of that information, that knows what's going on in the firm, is involved on a daily basis. So that individual may easily identify when changes in the firm or the firm's environment or engagements have actually taken place. So in that instance, the firm's policies or procedures for identifying the information may be very simple or maybe very informal. If we contrast that with a more larger or more complex firm, as things become more decentralized, there are a lot more people involved, it becomes more important then to have more formal policies or procedures in place to deal with identifying the information that may indicate a need for the firm to go and revisit those quality objectives, quality risks, or responses. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So a common question we get asked is, how is the firm's risk assessment process scalable? And I like to think of this, I like to contrast this with the airline industry. And if we think of aircrafts that need a pre-flight inspection, and if you think of a big commercial aircraft, it's very complex. There's a number of systems in the aircraft. It's carrying hundreds of passengers. And the pre-flight inspection in that case might be very rigorous and very intense. And if we contrast that with a microlight, which has a very basic engine, it's a couple of passengers, probably the pre-flight inspection in that instance would be very simple and not very complex. Nevertheless, in both cases, we don't want the planes falling out of the sky. And I think this is very similar if we look at ISQM1 and firms. We want firms to perform engagements appropriately and issue appropriate reports. But some firms, they're large and complex, and their systems are simply going to need a lot more. There's going to be a lot more going on that needs to be addressed or thought about, particularly as those engagements in those firms also become more larger and complex, and the firm may have more public type of entities for whom they perform engagements. Whereas a smaller firm, yes, we want to make sure that the engagements are appropriate and the reports that are issued are appropriate, but things are much simpler and less complex. And so it's expected that in those instances, those firms would have a much less complex system. ISQM1 is not designed to tell firms specifically what they need to do. Instead, it tells firms what they need to achieve. And in achieving that, of course, firms need to exercise professional judgment. So the quality risks we see as an opportunity for firms to really tailor the system to their circumstances. And I really can't emphasize enough how important it is to focus on the circumstances of the firm and the engagements and really think about how that gives rise to quality risks. As Julie mentioned, we haven't added lists of responses in ISQM1 because we really want to focus the firm on designing and implementing their own responses and what makes sense in the firm's own environment and what are those policies and procedures that the firm needs to mitigate the risks. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So I've seen a couple of questions come through on the timeline, and so just wanted to really cover off the effective date of ISQM1 and how this interacts with the firm's risk assessment process. So the effective date of ISQM1 is that the firm needs to have designed and implemented the system in compliance with ISQM1 by December 15th, 2022. And if we think about how that reflects upon the firm's risk assessment process, so first of all, the quality objectives need to be established by this date. And then secondly, the quality risks need to be identified and assessed by that date. Thirdly, the responses would need to be designed and implemented by December 15th, 2022, but they do not need to be operating by that date. They would operate from December 15th, 2022 onwards. So what does that mean? So if we take an example of where there's a response where it's perhaps a consultation, the response is about consulting on technical matters. And if we think about this being a firm which may have outsourced that consultation to a third-party service provider. So in this instance, by December 15th, 2022, the firm would need to have designed their policies and procedures on consultation. So that would specify what matters need to be consulted on and what is the process that engagement teams need to follow when they are consulting. And of course, by December 15th, 2022, the firm would need to obviously have that service provider they're going to use for those consultations in place and thought about whether that service provider is appropriate for use. However, the actual consultations, the actual act of doing the consultations would only start happening from December 15th, 2022 onwards. So Chun, that really brings us to the end of the presentation piece, and I think we can move on to any questions that have come through.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julie and Natalie, for walking us through the firm's risk assessment process in detail and with such clarity. Now, our Q&A panel, as you might expect, is buzzing with activity. A lot of questions have come through, but I think some of the earlier questions have been addressed as we progress with the presentation. For example, Natalie, your slide on the timeline explaining how it means, what it means, and also, there are a few questions on scalability, which I think you addressed very well already as well. Now, we're seeing some common themes coming through those questions. So what I'm going to do, given the time that we have, is try to package and bundle what I sense to be the most common questions. And I also see a few questions that might not be as common, but are worth tackling as well. So Julie, Natalie, I'll try to direct the questions to you based on which part of the presentation you did, but feel free to chime in if you have anything else to add on. And Julie, so let me first come to you with a question on quality risk. So you did you walk us through, using the flow chart, quality risk, and we actually have a few questions asked in different ways. But I think ultimately the question is about how detailed or how granular do the quality risks need to be. So could you help us elaborate on that, please?
Thanks, Shengmi, and hopefully this might not be a satisfying answer, but I think it's the answer that is realistic, which is it depends. So you remember when I talked about the quality risks, there's that threshold you need to meet. So that applies no matter how you're thinking about your quality risks. But I think a firm could determine that more granular risks make sense for them, and I think that that's a judgment that the firm makes. And when I was thinking about your question about how granular you might go, there's probably different aspects of ISQM1 that might drive that granularity. So you remember the quality objectives are multifaceted. The quality objectives have lots of different pieces to them. And you can see that in some of the areas like resources or relevant ethical requirements, where there's multi parts to the quality objectives. So that might be an area where a quality risk at the very high level just doesn't make sense. Yes, it meets the threshold, but you need to disaggregate it a little bit to actually drive at what the risk is and therefore design responses. In a big firm, you might have multiple process owners. So Natalie referred to a few occasions where you'd have less process owners, but a big firm, you might have multiple process owners, and maybe just dividing up or subdividing the quality risks makes sense there, because a process owner needs to really understand what their risks are and then what their responses are that they're responsible for. I also wonder if monitoring and remediation, Chun-Wei, might come into play. So how you might monitor the responses that address the risks might dictate how granular you might want to go. And maybe there's a one-to-many relationship between risks and responses, or one-to-one relationship. So it really is dependent on how a firm wants to set up their system, but just, I guess, fundamentally keep in mind that threshold they need to meet for quality risks would be there regardless.
Right. Well, I think that's a very helpful clarification, Julie. Given time, I'm just going to progress on to the next question quite quickly. Natalie, I think this next question is for you. Talking about establishing quality objectives, and we know that a big chunk of our standard is actually quality objectives and relating to different components. And one of the requirements is for the firm to think about whether you need additional quality objective that isn't covered by the ISQM1. And the question here is, can you give a few examples of the kind of quality objective that might be needed that are extra beyond what we have in ISQM1?
Great. Thanks, Chun-Wei. And I have to say, I do think that this was something we did think about a lot as the task force as we were developing ISQM1. A number of times we were trying to brainstorm and think about different examples of where additional quality objectives might be needed. And I do have to say that there were probably very limited examples that we came up with when we were discussing it as a task force. I think one of the examples we thought about, we did actually include as an example in the standard. So I think that describes a situation where local laws and regulations obviously have requirements in those laws and regulations. And I think the specific one we have is related to a governance code. where the firm has additional quality objectives that they have to then comply with in order to achieve those requirements of that governance code. So I think that that's the example we have in the standard. I think what's important here, Chun-Wee, is that it's not expected to be common that firms actually establish those additional quality objectives. And we've explicitly acknowledged that. I can't remember if it's in the standard, but it's certainly in the guide, the accompanying guide that we have issued. Having said that, though, I do think something to bear in mind is, of course, ISQM 1 has been written in today's environment, and this is a standard that's going to be around for a number of years into the future. And so things may change in the future, and we may see that going forward, the quality objectives that we have in ISQM 1 today might not cover what needs to be covered in the future, and more maybe additional quality objectives may need to be established. Back over to you, Chun-Wee.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. And I do remember those conversations. We were really trying very hard to find examples. But I think your last point, Natalie, about this standard is really meant to be really proactive, and you need to be agile to all the changes. So that might be in instances where you need to formulate and establish new quality objectives later on. And talking about changes, and Natalie, you mentioned COVID in your presentation, and I think no conversation today will be complete without reference to COVID. Julie, I might come to you with that question now. So COVID brought about obviously unprecedented challenges for firms, and many firms, if not all firms, were really unprepared for such an event when it landed last year. So if we now put an ISQM lens over it, how would a firm deal with COVID in the context of quality objective, quality risk, and responses?
Yeah, and it was very unprecedented, and I don't think any of us saw it coming. So to say, development of a standard, thinking about a pandemic probably wasn't in the forefront of our minds. But I do think that as we talked about, Chun-Wee, the quality objectives that we've laid out in ISQM 1 are robust. And I think the fact that they're principles based, and they're based on the fact that a firm needs to derive their risks and drive their responses from risks, really helps in having the flexibility for ISQM 1 to deal with things that would come up, like COVID, for example. No requirement for sure for a firm to start thinking about unforeseen events that may happen in the future, because you'll remember that, and I bring you back to that threshold point about the quality risk, it really comes back to likelihood of occurring. And so you do have to keep that in mind, right? Because you could go to the ends of the earth to try to think about things that might happen, but that would be a very long and arduous exercise. But I think what we've seen, at least to date, is that the quality objectives, because they're principle based, because they set out what a firm needs to establish, could accommodate COVID without additional quality objectives. But what might need to change in the context of a pandemic or something that really disrupts a firm might be, are there different risks that are arising? Or maybe the risks are more pronounced in some areas of the firm versus others. Or maybe there's an area where the firm needs to think about different responses. So just some examples from my own experience. Things like how engagement teams are directed, supervise, and review became a big issue in the pandemic, because most of us started working remotely. So does a firm need to think about their responses to that area of resources, and making sure that those supervisors or those engagement partners have the right resources to be able to execute those responsibilities in a remote environment? Adjustments to IT. Sure, a lot of firms are using various aspects of IT, but maybe that really took off and more IT resources were used as a result. More service providers potentially might have been involved. So it's thinking about those areas of ISQM 1 as well. Maybe learning had to be adjusted, for instance, to focus more on professional skepticism, or how to really just manage an engagement in a COVID environment. So I guess all of that to say is that I think that there would be an impact of COVID on a firm. I think it probably comes to light more in quality risks and responses in that way, because the quality objectives kind of stand as their own as a suite for the firm.
Right. And Julie, I think all the examples you gave are really on point. I'm sure our audience can identify with the many things that you said. If we stay a little bit longer with this question, and we had COVID, and it's probably going to stay with us a little bit longer. And going forward, there may be other COVIDs, other unforeseen events that come up. So again, just linking it back to identification of quality risk, to what extent are the firms expected to deal with risk related to unforeseen events that could again leave them unprepared, as was the case in COVID?
Right, and I think that I touched on this a little bit in that there's no requirement for firms to think about every possible circumstance. You really do need to have that lens of the I'll call it the likelihood lens on it, the possibility of occurring. But Natalie mentioned in one of her slides around making sure the firm has a policy and a process for remaining alert to things that come up, and that is an important piece, because a firm cannot just set up their process, their system of quality management, sort of have to say, here you go, it's set up, and then walk away and never to think about how to modify it and be reactive to things that are happening. So there is that requirement for firms to remain alert. I think that a lot of us in firms who saw early instances of the pandemic coming would have been alert to things that might be risks, and it's really being responsive. So ISQM1 is meant to be proactive, iterative, responsive, and that requirement is really there to address that.
Thank you, Julie. Now, Natalie, I need to come to you now with everyone's favorite question. And this is an important question. And I think as our participants listen to the presentation, I'm sure in their mind they're formulating how they're going to do things, how they're going to do it. But ultimately, from a documentation perspective, what is the expectation? What are the firms expected to document for the firm's risk assessment process? Could you enlighten us on that?
Yes, Chun, I think that is a very common question that we do get, and I think it's important to remember what purpose the documentation is serving, and it's really about making sure that documentation supports an understanding of ISQM1. Obviously, the documentation is important for people in the firm to know what is expected of them and what they need to go and do, so that that documentation of those policies and procedures. It's about having documentation to support monitoring. Of course, that's a very key part. And of course, external regulators coming in and inspecting that documentation, that's important to them. But it also becomes important down the line, I think, where you need to retain that organizational knowledge, and obviously that documentation then becomes quite important down the line. So ISQM1 is the way it sets up the documentation requirements is that you have an overall principles-based documentation requirement, which is basically described in a way that the firm has to document to achieve those principles. But then it has some more specific things that need to be documented that are set out in the standard. And I think those specific things are documenting your quality objectives, your quality risks, and your responses, as well as how those responses actually address those quality risks. So in the first time implementation guide that we have issued, there are a couple of examples there to really show how that might look. But I think what's very important there is in a less complex firm where there's a lot less going on, showing that relationship between the quality objectives, risks, and responses is a lot easier because there's not as many different responses and different quality risks. I think the more complex a firm becomes and the more that there are these risks and responses, the more important it does, the more necessary it will be to kind of show those relationships and show what relates to what. So really encourage folks to just take a look at that guide and look at the examples we've put in there for documentation.
Fantastic, and I think I really like how you also talk about the scalability aspect of documentation, which I think is critically important. We have sort of run out of time. I think if we can just maybe fit in one more question. Julie, let me just throw that last question to you. And this reminds me of what we saw coming through some of the responses to our ED exposure draft. A natural and seemingly logical approach to identifying quality risk is to just flip the quality objective over. So for example, under governance and leadership, you have this point about leadership demonstrates a commitment to quality through their actions and behaviors. And if you think about quality risk, you might say that, oh, I just flip it over and say leadership does not demonstrate that commitment. So is that the right way to think about quality risk? Would this be actually an acceptable approach, Julie?
Yeah, and it sounds attractive, right? Because you have the quality objectives, and then you just think about them in the inverse, and that might be your quality risk. But I don't think doing that really, Chung-Lee, gets at the heart of what we're trying to achieve in the firm's risk assessment process, and it goes back to those events, conditions, circumstances, and actions that I talked about. Because in your example, if you just flipped it and kind of put the quality objective in the inverse, you really aren't getting at what is specific to that firm. What is I understand, how does leadership act in that firm? How is it structured in that firm? Has that leader, been involved in quality before? What risks actually might arise based on the facts and circumstances of the firm? And I think if you were just thinking about the quality objective in the inverse, as you described it, you really wouldn't get at the underlying reasons for the risk, and therefore your responses are probably not going to be very specific and really hard to demonstrate how you've done a risk assessment process. And I think it also goes back to thinking really about what those quality risks are and the linkage that you really need to think about those in the effect that what effect do they have on the quality objectives, because that is a quality risk. And I know earlier on in the presentation I mentioned about a risk to quality is not a quality risk, but because really what we're doing in ISQM1 is thinking about those risks that would affect and adversely affect the quality objectives. And that's how you have to think about it in this context.
Thank you very much, Julie. I think that's really helpful clarification. Hopefully we won't see that risk that described that way going forward. So can we have the slides back again? So I just make a few comments to close off this session. I want to express a very sincere thank you to everyone who have engaged us with comments, with your questions. As mentioned, we definitely hope to address those questions. We did not manage to get through today, and there are a lot of those questions in the upcoming 3 webinars. Now, before we close, I'd like to share with you some of the tools and resources that are available from IAASB, as you can see on the slide. The first-time implementation guide that I think Natalie mentioned earlier for ISQM1, as well as ISQM2, have just been published last week, and they are now available on our website. I personally find them incredibly helpful, very easy to read, very easy to get through. They walk through the standard for us and help us understand the more complex areas with a lot of practical examples. And also the key changes from the extant standards have been highlighted as well. We also have fact sheets for each of the quality management standards, provide high-level overview of the standard, very helpful for those of us who just need that broad-level explanation of what the respective quality management standards are about. We have a number of videos and other webinars available on our YouTube channel and on our webpage. Some of them in different languages, Spanish, French, 普通话, Chinese. And one of the videos that I would like to highlight is an interview that focused on initial implementation efforts. And it's conducted by Natalie, featuring Julie, as well as a former IAASB board member, Brendan Motard, who is a partner with a mid-sized firm and who has been instrumental in bringing small, medium-sized firms' perspective into the development of our standards. And I'm sure you will find the interview practical, relatable, and insightful. And of course, don't forget to join us for the 3 upcoming webinars that we are co-organizing with IFAC. Next slide, please. Follow us on Twitter, follow us on LinkedIn to stay up to date with IAASB activities. Please also visit the dedicated quality management webpage to access all our materials relating to quality management. And the URL is iwaasb.org/quality-management. Thank you once again to Julie, to Natalie for a fantastic session. And on behalf of IWASB and IFAC, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Chun. Have a nice day ahead. And if you're from my part of the world, have a very good evening. Let me hand you back to Gabby. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chun-Wee, and all of our participants and panelists today. Just as a gentle reminder, IFAC does not provide continuing professional education credits. However, all attendees will be receiving an email that confirms their attendance and participation in today's event. You are free and welcome to use this to verify your participation today. As mentioned by Chun-Wee, all of the recording of this event will be available on the IAASB YouTube channel, as well as on the IFAC page under the events. As you close out of this event, you will be asked to take a short survey that helps us to continuously improve the quality, value, and variety of topics that we choose for our educational and informational resources and events that we produce. We ask you to please take a moment to complete that survey to help us in our journey of continuously providing you high quality events. As mentioned by Chun-Wee, we also look forward to welcoming you to our next event on July 29th. A registration for this and all succeeding events as part of this series on ISQM is presently available. Thank you very much. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.